Hey guys, this is Miss Harlequin, and in this video, I'm just going to give you some quick background information that's going to help make the reading of our unit poems and the excerpt from The Wonderful Wizard of Oz just a little bit easier. It's basically going to be some background that will help your understanding of where the poets are coming from and the types of topics they're writing about, and the same thing for The Wizard of Oz. Alright, so we're going to start talking with the poems. As we mentioned in class, the poems are going to be about different cities and the author is describing their chosen cities. So just in general, cities are a fairly new concept, especially cities with the type of technology and buildings that we have. So in the early 1900s, there was a race to build skyscrapers. John J. Roscoe decided to build the Empire State Building. And construction for that building took 1 year and 45 days. And on May 1931, it became the tallest building in the world. The construction workers who built the country's famous skyscrapers often encountered very dangerous conditions on the job. You have to think about it. A skyscraper is so humongous. I mean, just look at this building right here in the picture. And right up here, you can actually see the scaffolding, which means that this top part of the building is not yet built. You can see the difference between the bottom and the top. So just think about how, if you were a construction worker, how you would feel being out in this open-aired construction area, building it, and you look down and you're so far from the ground. So it's definitely dangerous. They have to work, especially back in the day, without harnesses and safety equipment, and it was often hundreds of feet above ground. But in 1929, the construction industry had the second highest national death rate, right behind the mining industry. So basically, it was the most dangerous job you could have in America. But in 1987, a law in New York City required that nets be fastened to high-rise construction sites to help protect workers who fall. And construction workers also had to wear harnesses. And other states have issued similar safety laws. So nowadays, it's not quite as dangerous, although it's not exactly safe. Still, with those laws, it's a lot better. Alright, so now I want to talk about one particular poet that we're going to be reading. One of the poems is written by Langston Hughes, and Langston Hughes is probably one of the most famous poets in America. If you haven't yet read a poem by Langston Hughes, don't worry, you're going to read plenty throughout your middle school and high school career. He is one of the most taught poets and one of the most famous African-American poets. And you can see on the screen, this is one of his most famous poems, very short one. And this is an excerpt from another one of his very famous poems. This is actually a poem you're going to read in 7th grade, in the 7th grade Codex workbook. Alright, so Langston Hughes was born James Mercer Langston Hughes, and he was born on February 1st, 1902. He's a famous author and a poet. He's actually written short stories as well as poems. His work mainly focused on Black themes and heritage, and he was one of the first writers to use jazz rhythms and dialect in his work in order to represent urban Blacks. And so when we use dialect, what we're really talking is language that is very specific to a group of people or to a specific area. For example, a lot of people who live in the southern part of the United States have a southern dialect. There are words that they use, like y'all, that we don't really use up here in the northern part of the country. When he was in high school, Hughes lived in the attic of a house located at 2266 East 86th Street in Cleveland, Ohio. Ohio is a state that's very close to New York. The attic had sloped ceilings or slanted ceilings, just like this, and was small. It was in this attic that Hughes did a lot of his reading and writing. The end of World War I brought many economic and artistic opportunities to Harlem. So the end of World War I is happening in the 1910s. Hughes was attracted to the growing cultural scene in the area, and he moved into a brownstone at 20 East 127th Street in Harlem, New York. He was a major contributor to the Harlem Renaissance. That's the time period in the 1920s that's happening in Harlem. So in the previous slide, I talked about how there was a growing cultural scene that was happening in Harlem. That growing cultural scene became the Harlem Renaissance. That's where in Harlem in the 1920s, there were so many artists, writers, musicians, like the jazz band that's shown in this picture, who were all living in Harlem and creating these really wonderful works of art. All right, so now we're going to talk about The Wizard of Oz. So The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is a novel by American writer Frank Baum, and it's a very popular story that's inspired several movies, lots of TV events, a lot of stage performances. Like we know, we had the Bayview Players put on The Wonderful Wizard of Oz last year, and some literary adaptations. The first edition of the book, meaning it's a copy of one of the first books ever printed. It was published in 1900, and it sells, or is worth, $100,000. In 1939, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was adapted or turned into the most famous movie of The Wizard of Oz, starring Judy Garland, who was a very famous actress, starred in a lot of musicals, as Dorothy. Now, the movie, surprisingly, didn't really do well at the box office. It didn't make a lot of money. But in 1956, the movie was reintroduced to the public because that's when television was first invented and becoming very big. So it aired on television, and once that happened, the movie became extremely popular. It's now considered one of the most famous films ever made. Now, in the original book, Dorothy's shoes are silver. However, in the movie, and probably the most famous, they're known as the ruby slippers. The creators of the movie changed it because ruby slippers are a lot more colorful on screen. A pair of the ruby slippers that Dorothy, meaning the actress, Judy Garland, wore in the movie are on display at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. You'll be able to visit that institution when you go on your senior trip to Washington, D.C. when you're in the 8th grade. All right, and finally, in 2013, Oz the Great and Powerful, which is a new version of The Wizard of Oz, debuted in movie theaters. The movie, which explores how the story's wizard came to Oz, was a huge hit, and it thus proves just how popular Baum's original story still is today.